It was the kind of voice that made judges on Britain's Got Talent freeze mid-breath. Deep, operatic, trembling with raw soul. Jonathan Antoine, just 17 at the time, had the world in awe. But behind that angelic sound, hidden from the standing ovations and roaring applause, was a young man quietly fighting demons that almost silenced him forever. Few knew then that Jonathan was being bullied so brutally at school, he would later admit to having thoughts of ending it all. His talent became a shield, his music a refuge, but even as millions watched him rise, Jonathan was slowly collapsing under the weight of expectations, confusion, and emotional wounds no one could see. Years later, he would open up about a secret that explained so much of his pain, but at the height of his fame, he was still just a terrified teenager, smiling for the cameras while quietly breaking inside. And that's where the real story begins. When Jonathan Antoine stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent in 2012, he wasn't the kind of performer the audience expected. Nervous, overweight, eyes barely meeting the judges, he stood beside his singing partner Charlotte Giaconelli, visibly unsure if he even belonged there. But the moment he opened his mouth, the entire room changed. Singing the prayer with the voice of a seasoned tenor trapped in a teenage frame, Jonathan just performed. He stunned the nation. The performance went viral overnight, with comparisons to Luciano Pavarotti flooding social media. Simon Cowell, known for his ruthless candor, predicted stardom. Jonathan and Charlotte, just classmates before the show, were suddenly thrust into global fame as the duo Jonathan and Charlotte. Their chemistry, both musically and emotionally, captured the hearts of millions. They signed a £1 million record deal with Simon's label Psycho, released 2 albums, and became symbols of underdog triumph. But behind the whirlwind success, Jonathan remained conflicted. He loved music, but hated the spotlight. He felt like a passenger in a vehicle moving too fast, unable to steer. The fame didn't quiet his insecurities, it amplified them. As crowds chanted his name, Jonathan struggled to even recognize the boy they were cheering for. By 2014, just 2 years after their stunning debut, the harmonious duo of Jonathan and Charlotte shocked fans by parting ways. On the surface, the split was amicable, 2 young talents choosing separate artistic paths. But for Jonathan Antoine, the decision carried far more emotional weight than most realized. At just 19, he had to walk away from the one person who helped anchor him during his most chaotic years. Industry insiders speculate about creative disagreements and conflicting visions, but Jonathan remained composed in public, simply stating it was time for them to grow individually. Behind the scenes, however, the transition to a solo career was a quiet storm. While Charlotte pivoted toward musical theater, Jonathan went deeper into classical music, pouring his soul into his 2014 solo debut album, Tenore. The album soared to #1 on the UK classical charts, an apparent triumph, but the journey was anything but smooth. Without the safety of a partner on stage, the anxiety returned. He now carried the weight of the performance, the criticism, and the expectations alone. Tours were grueling. The media focused relentlessly on his appearance, and though his voice continued to mesmerize, Jonathan found himself questioning whether the dream he was chasing still felt like his own. In interviews, he hinted at feeling lost in the transition. The applause was still loud, but the silence backstage grew louder. As his solo career progressed, it became clear that something deeper was unresolved, something that neither success nor song could mend. Behind the thunderous applause and endless praise that Jonathan Antoine received on stage was a shadowed reality few ever saw. A deep, ongoing mental battle that had begun long before fame ever found him. From a young age, Jonathan felt different, but not in a way that brought pride or joy. He became a target for relentless bullying at school, mocked for his weight, his gentle voice, and his emotional nature, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own world. He later described his school years as an emotional hell, a period that planted the seeds of self-doubt and silent suffering. When he first stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent, many mistook his anxiety for simple stage fright, unaware that a storm of internal chaos was raging beneath his composed surface, crippling anxiety, piercing self-doubt, and a haunting sense of unworthiness. Even at the peak of his success with the duo Jonathan and Charlotte, Jonathan's confidence unraveled in private, and the spotlight that lit up his talent also magnified his inner turmoil. He grew increasingly withdrawn, emotionally numb, and during his darkest periods, Jonathan later admitted to having seriously contemplated ending his own life, a revelation he would share years later with a heartbreaking honesty that stunned fans. What made it worse was the lack of explanation. Why did everyday situations feel so overwhelming? Why did his emotions swing so wildly? He sought therapy, support, guidance. None of it seemed to fully explain the pain he carried daily. So he smiled, performed, and let his music do the speaking, even as each song masked a silent cry for help that few truly understood. And then, after years of unanswered questions, a single diagnosis changed everything, offering clarity, healing, and a powerful turning point. In 2023, during a rare and candid interview, Jonathan Antoine revealed something that stopped fans in their tracks, a diagnosis that finally made sense of the chaos he had been living with his entire life. He had been diagnosed with autism. For Jonathan, the revelation wasn't a label, it was liberation. Suddenly, everything had context. The sensory overload, the paralyzing anxiety, the deep need for structure, the overwhelming emotions that often made him feel like a stranger in his own body. He described the moment as everything clicking into place. Autism, often misunderstood and misrepresented, had quietly shaped Jonathan's world long before he or anyone else realized. It wasn't the source of his voice, but it was the silent force behind the way he processed sound, emotion, and connection. Looking back, even his breakout moment on Britain's Got Talent took on new meaning. He hadn't just been nervous, he'd been enduring an internal earthquake of sensory input and emotional vulnerability. But Jonathan didn't share this diagnosis to seek pity. He shared it to offer hope. For the first time, he began to openly talk about his mental health, his fears, and how the late diagnosis allowed him to forgive himself for years of unexplained struggles. Autism didn't define him, but it helped him define his path forward. Fans saw a talented tenor. Now they were beginning to see the layers of complexity behind that gift. A young man slowly discovering who he truly was, not just on stage, but off it. After years of silently battling depression, anxiety, and the crushing pressures of public life, Jonathan Antoine made a decision that would alter the course of his personal journey. He chose to put himself first. Away from the glare of stage lights and screaming fans, Jonathan began to rebuild from within, not with the urgency of a comeback, but with the quiet determination to finally feel whole. He focused on healthier routines, adjusted his lifestyle, and most importantly, started tending to his mental health with the seriousness it deserved. In time, he shed over 4 stone, more than 50 pounds, not out of vanity, but as a symbolic shedding of years of emotional baggage. However, as Jonathan has said himself, the most powerful transformation wasn't physical, it was internal. He began speaking openly about his darkest moments, about being bullied, about mental illness, and about finally being diagnosed with autism. For the first time, fans didn't just hear his voice, they heard his truth. The once silent young man who trembled on a talent show stage had become a thoughtful advocate for self-acceptance, using his platform not just to sing, but to speak for those who felt unseen. Musically, he began exploring a more honest creative path, blending genres, releasing music that reflected his full emotional spectrum, not just a polished operatic surface. And publicly, he appeared lighter, freer, no longer defined by the pressure to be perfect, but instead empowered by his imperfections. Jonathan Antoine wasn't just healing, he was evolving, and in that evolution, his voice grew even more powerful, not because of how it sounded, but because of how deeply it resonated with the truth of who he really is. Jonathan Antoine's story was never just about the voice. It was never solely about the viral standing ovation, the million-pound record deal, or the dream of becoming Britain's next great tenor. Beneath the headlines and high notes was a quiet, complex battle for identity, acceptance, and survival. The Untold Heartbreak wasn't a dramatic fall from fame or a scandalous secret. It was the invisible, daily ache of a young man who felt unworthy of love, crushed by self-doubt, and misunderstood by the very world that cheered him on. But what makes Jonathan's journey extraordinary isn't just that he survived, it's that he chose to stay, to speak, to transform. His diagnosis didn't close a chapter, it opened one. His struggles didn't break him, they taught him how to rebuild. In redefining success not as perfection but as authenticity, Jonathan Antoine has given his audience something far more powerful than a flawless performance. He's given them permission to be human. For every bullied child, every anxious teenager, every misunderstood soul hiding behind talent or silence, his story is a quiet revolution. It's a reminder that the greatest triumphs are not always won on stage, but within the battles no one else sees. And as Jonathan continues to sing, now not to escape himself, but to embrace himself, his voice carries something even deeper than before, the sound of someone who finally knows who they are and is no longer afraid to let the world hear it.